Amandla. Amandla. Matla. Aruna. Molweni. Andazi noba ndiyavakala kakuhle na. Can everyone hear me? Molweni, igama lam Yvonne. I'm the co-director of operations here at the Forge. And mine is to just facilitate a discussion yanamhlanje with the three speakers. So, welcome. I also want to greet and welcome bonke aba basijoyine ngokuxhakaxhaka banamhlanje okanye i-live stream. Namhlanje ke we're talking about something which is very important, but something which is very painful for some of us to talk about. And I ask that we please bear with one another. Mine is to give context to the conversation tonight and to facilitate the entire discussion. So I am going to start with the context, and after me, Prishani Naidu from SWOP is going to also give a few words, and after that, Nare and Mulemo from MADEYOULOOK are going to give a few words. This is a partnership between the Forge, SWOP, and MADEYOULOOK. So, the topic of the panel tonight is the forgotten rural. I want to start with a little bit of history. And I also want to give some of the several dimensions of the land questions or land matters in South Africa. So the land question in South Africa has several dimensions. This includes the gendered and racially skewed distribution of land, the insecure land tenure for farm workers and farm dwellers, the urban land question, the insecure tenure for residents of the former Bantustans or the former homelands, and the erosion of their rights, their land rights, and the role of traditional leadership in the former Bantustans, among other factors. And the discussion tonight focuses primarily on the lived experiences and the land struggles of people living in the former Bantustans or the former homelands. And we'll know that, for a little bit of history, the homelands were a result of legislations of bifurcation between black and white people in South Africa. This ensured the demarcation into so-called black and white areas in South Africa. So as defined by advocate Tembeka Toby, who writes a lot about land in South Africa, these homelands were African reserves allocated to the country's different black ethnic groups, established in 1951 by the Bantu Authorities Act, introduced by the government of Daniel Francois Malan as part of the policy of apartheid. The homelands were independent states of which each African was assigned by the government according to their record of origin. But here's the main thing why it was there. For black Africans to lose citizenship in South Africa and to rob them of any right of involvement with the South African Parliament, which held complete hegemony over the homelands. So kukholo mbali injalo we abantu abamnyama babevinjwa ukuba babe ngabantu abagcweleyo, kungafuneki ukuba ba-own umhlaba okanye to hold land in various ways. So urhulumente wethu embarked on what is called a land reform program with 3 pillars: land restitution, which is meant for people who lost land, but the date is 1913, but we know that dispossession started way before that. So that's already something we can critique. There's also the land redistribution, which not only is limited to abantu who lost land, but because of this history, people can still claim land. And then there's land tenure. And that is the land tenure reform was devised to secure forms of land tenure, particularly in the former homelands. However, we know that I hold the view that the land reform program has failed dismally. And I want to categorize the failure or some aspects of the failure using a term which I've come to love and adopt in my own work, which is a word that Professor Ruth Wilson Gilmore uses, of organized abandonment. Which is to say that thinking about organized abandonment should bring us to consider how capital, large and small, and the state, municipal or greater, work together to raise barriers for some people and lower them for others. And organized abandonment, in the context of tonight's topic of the forgotten rural, produces the experience of having been forgotten or left out. And affected communities and activists, including Auskoni, who's here and I'll introduce later, have characterized this relationship as a threat which comes from the covenant between our democratic government, big mining companies, and traditional leadership. And this is a covenant which they have continued to resist. We know that it's not only a story about dispossession and violation and assassination or murder, but it's also a story of resistance. Black people have always resisted, and they are resisting nanamhlanje. And I'm not going to speak a lot about this because Uaskona might touch on this, but one of the current campaigns is the Stop the Bantustan Bills campaigns. But if we leave with anything tonight, let us remember that what is important is that when we talk about land, we're talking about abantu, batu, people. And as I'm about to end, Mbuso reminds us that land is not just about economic issues. And he says a very powerful thing in his work. It's also about the question of where will I die? And Dineo also reminds us that sometimes there is no last place to rest. So this is the context of the land question in South Africa. That the dispossession is perpetual. It never stopped. And there are various aspects of why this is so. And I'll end with the words of Meg Grace from the Lesetleng community. Meg Grace, just for context, was the first applicant from the Maledu judgment, which ruled that a mining company which is granted a mining license over customary land still requires the consent of the land rights holders. Utige Umam Grace, and I'm going to end and hand over to SWOP. Here's something from Mom Grace. Our government, I am appealing to you. Know that we are people. Nkosi. Mama Mama Wema, Wema, Mama Wema, Mama Wema, Mama Wema, Mama Wema, Wema, Mama Wema. Nkosi. I'm now going to hand over to Prashani Naidu to give us a few words from SWOP.
Okay, evening everyone. I'm not going to say a lot. I was asked to just welcome you all and thank you for being here on behalf of SWOP, Made You Look, the Forge and the Goethe Institute. SWOP is the Society Work and Politics Institute at Wits University, and I wanted to thank Nare and Molemo in particular for bringing us into this collaboration in the first instance through Dineo. But I hope this is going to be a collaboration that goes beyond this set of initial engagements. And I'm saying that because we are based at Wits University, and the university is this year celebrating 100 years of its existence. And as SWOP, we've been running a program, and this is part of it, called 100 Years of the Colonial University in Africa. And we think it's important to draw attention to that question of the ongoing coloniality that we experience in the university, and in particular, I think in relation to the conversation today and this set of collaborations, how a particular idea of knowledge is reproduced and what that means for how we can change the world. So central to our work is the question of alternatives. So not just knowing the world, but knowing it in order to change it. But given that we are in a world in crisis, even those systems of knowing the world, how we come to understand ourselves in the world, are in crisis. And so this set of collaborations is important for us because we think that we need to acknowledge in the first instance, if we want to create and discover alternatives, that we do not know, that we do not always know, that we do not always see, that we can't sometimes see. And I think the set of collaborations is important for opening up spaces through which we can see, know, hear, make sense of the world in different ways. So we've also started collaborating across, we come from a tradition of the social sciences, we're based in the humanities at Wits, but we're also at a moment where the humanities and social sciences are in crisis, and we've been coming together with artists, with activists who are outside of the university in an attempt to find new ways of making sense of ourselves in the world and sensing the world with that central goal of alternatives. So thanks again, and I'm looking forward to the conversation tonight, and I'm looking forward to our ongoing engagements beyond this. Thanks.
Ubano waqale hlasela impi yamasosha akamisa useve akamisa inombolo ubano waqale hlasela impi yamasosha impi yamasosha impi yamasosha impi yamagerilla ubano waqale hlasela impi yamasosha akamisa useve akamisa inombolo ubano waqale hlasela impi yamasosha impi yabahlali impi yasikote ubano waqale hlasela impi yamasosha Mandla. And Gokuke, I'm going to allow for Nare and Molemo to also give us a few words from Made You Look.
Okay, My name is Nari Mokoto, and this over here is my collaborator, Willem. Together we've been working for like 13 years as artists, and over the past 5 years we have been working on a variety of land-related questions, and the way in which we generally work is with a kind of broader community practice, many of whom are in the room actually, and some on stage. So we'd like to actually thank you for accepting our invitation and bringing us into your own practice.
We are here today as the first day of 10 days of a program. We come together in part because a number of artists from around the world were gathered together as a part of a project called Documenta over the last couple of months. And out of that project, we realized that many artists from around the world are really committed to the question of land. And as Yvonne has already said, land is about abantu, it's about culture, it's about spirituality, it's about belonging, and we have realized that a lot of artists from around the world are asking the same questions. And so we are going to be sharing and having conversations over the next 10 days, including some artists from this collective who joined us here today, from Morocco, Nadir, if you'll wave, and from Lebanon, Marwa, if you'll wave. And so we're also going to be learning about land struggles in other parts of the world. We'll also be joined online with people from Kenya, from Indonesia, and many other places. And so land issues are a very specific issue in South Africa, but actually our struggles connect to many other parts of the world. So we'll be having this conversation over the next 10 days, and you're welcome. Thank you very much for joining us today, and thank you very much to SWOP and to the Forge for hosting us. We really look forward to really sharing together. Thank you.
We're first going to hear from Skosana, then we're going to hear from Mbuso, and then we'll hear from Dineo. But just briefly, I do want to read their bios because we're going to proceed from one speaker to the next. I'll start with Skosana's bio. Constance Mogale, coordinator of the Alliance for Rural Democracy. Her work with the Alliance for Rural Democracy has been involved in leading a national campaign to the proposed laws dubbed as the Bantustan Bills, which would affect the tenure, the governance, and rights of nearly 20 million people living in South Africa's communal areas. She is currently the MA Field candidate at the Institute for Poverty, Land, and Agrarian Studies. About Mbuso. Mbuso Nkosi is a versatile researcher. He has focused on labor studies, industrial policy, economic development, agrarian studies, archives, and social theory. He served as the editor of the Global Labour column and the South African Labour Bulletin. He currently lectures in the Department of Sociology at the University of Pretoria. Our last speaker, Dineo Skosana, is a senior researcher at SWOP, or the Society of Work and Politics Institute. She works on mining and use dispossession in coal-affected areas. She has published on the continued salience of traditional leadership in post-apartheid South Africa. She has an interest in indigenous politics, rural struggles, as well as the politics over land, sacred sites, heritage, and belonging. Nkosi Mcala, Mtunana, please can you give them a round of applause? Sabalendawo, Imbilendawo, say Sabalendawo, Imbilendawo, say Sabalendawo. Sabalendawo, Imbilendawo, Imbilendawo, Sabalendawo, Imbilendawo. Away to Ngingani. Connie, I'll hand over to you.
Manda!
Away to Ngingani.
Manda!
Away to Ngingani.
So, my name is Constance Mogale, Ngigama. I am a rural girl from the northwest, from two families, from my father and my mother, who were forcefully removed by apartheid government from their land. So the community from my mother's land, which is, it was a farm worker community, but they entered into a deal under the South African Native Development Trust that I think from 1936, the 1936 Act and the 1949 Act, that they were like farm dwellers but leasing to buy, and they had very high hope that they will be the owners of the land. But when government saw that the period that was agreed to is about to lapse, they forcefully removed them. But it is a story of all over the country where people were dispossessed of their land long before 1930. In 1980, there was this commission, acquisition of land commission called AGLA. So people started looking for land then during apartheid. And the community where my mother's coming from, forcefully occupied in 1989. They forcefully occupied the land. And you know, all this Bakubungu, so people started occupying forcefully because they tried to negotiate with the then Department of Agriculture, but they couldn't get the results. And at that time, the Legal Resource Center, the Black Search, was their organizing or support organizations. So Land Restitution Act was never a goodwill of the new government. It was a force and a result of a lobby. And a rural lobby for land, for rural land. So when they started the commission and saying we open up for claims, people must lodge the claims. People started questioning. We already lodged the claim under the acquisition of land commission. Why is our government now wanting claim from us? We don't want to lodge a claim. Because it's going to be technical, delaying. How do you investigate? When I'm saying this is my land, there's my mother's grave, my great-grandfather's grave, because the graves which I think was Dineo will talk about, it is our sign, our only evidence of tenure. So for young people who don't visit graves, you must know that you will never know where you come from, because that is the only evidence that black people had to verify that they were forcefully removed in that land. So restitution, we thought it was going to be pushed because some of our comrades who were working with the same organization, Council of Churches or whatever, went into government, and we thought they are coming into government to fast track, and we were excited, and we were taken with buses to conferences, to hotels, and you know, and thinking that okay, this is okay. It was never okay. It was a distraction of what we were supposed to do, because our great grandfathers used to go or sleep in the grass, cut the grass and make mattress to make sure that they are there, they are present, they are nearer there. They used to travel with donkeys and whatever to go to Pretoria to make sure that their voices are heard at Kodesa. Yet, Tina, we want to sleep in the hotels. So I am here to talk about the forgotten rural. Because even if they say statistics, okay, we are about to finalize the restitution, this is the numbers per province. If you look at the ratio and the scale, it is even land claims that they are settling through cash compensation. They are not settling through land so that they can say, okay, people were removed from Sophia Town. This is the piece of land which we can demarcate nicely and design it in a way that they're not going to be laborers anymore. Because remember, Soweto was a labor basket for them. The same leadership of our country who used to criticize the apartheid government to say these houses are just toolboxes for labor. They are matchboxes. Today, what kind of houses are they building in there? Even more worse. So they are scrambling and squeezing us into smaller and smaller spaces. And they concentrating on giving titles to people in Soweto with using private titling, which is, we know there are programs on TV like Kuse Kayala. So if you give a title to my uncle and she marries a very rude Mama Lume, I'm not going to get any rights. So there are those inter-household dynamics. But in the rural areas, they didn't care, but because they thought that land was dry and arid and there's nothing, so they just dumped us there, and they dumped women there because they passed our men and ferried them to for the mining labor to the hostels, the male dormitories. And now they have realized that arid land is richer than they thought. So when we voted for South Africa, the new South Africa, we knew that the Buputatswana was demolished, Orange Free State was demolished, Leboa Khomo, KwaZulu Natal. We knew that we are becoming one South Africa, and we are adopting a new vision of democratic South Africa, where people will elect their leaders democratically through a ballot paper. Extensive, robust education, political education was done, and then we were told, your vote is your secret. Now they have realized that no, we have to remove these people from the communal land. So out of the 3 legs of land reform, it's only restitution which is in the constitution, which we can take them to court and whatever. Redistribution, there's no act. So redistribution was the hope for the future, to take us out of the custodian of Bomalube and get our own land, to redistribute land, to make sure that there's skewed patterns of ownership in South Africa, where the minority white has 87%. There's an argument that it has changed, but I mean, that's the narrative I learned and memorized. So they still have the land. The black majority is having 4% of the land. 4%. So when we say 13%, we still had to divide it across race, because there's Indians, there's the so-called colored or Khoisan. So I am saying the so-called because the colored, it's a debatable term where we are being labeled. So the alliance, I'm working for the Alliance for Rural Democracy. So the Alliance for Rural Democracy is a collaboration of research organizations, mobilization, and litigation. So I had the mobilization part, and then I think my comrade Reverend Mbuso from KwaZulu Natal is here. So the challenge about the alliance was that we worked in communal, we limited ourselves to communal areas, the former Bantustan, because we saw that now the customary land rights of people is under attack. And there's a collaboration and a coalition of traditional leaders, the mining companies, big companies, and government. So the Mining and Petroleum Development Act, I'm not going to talk about it, but it took, so they've changed legislation to make sure that if you are a title owner, you don't own the mineral rights, you own the surface rights. But they made it in 2002. So only the title rights owner who were mostly white could apply for mineral rights and be given a priority, because for you to apply you must be a land rights holder in terms of their private title, their common law and the Western law, not recognizing customary law. So in 2002 they gave them the right to apply, but black people were left out because they didn't have any security of tenure to say this is my land, therefore I'm applying for it. Okay, so that legislation is a Bantustan. It dispossessed people of that wealth. All right, and then in 1996, there was a realization that people who were denied land because of apartheid legislation, and so Section 25, subsection 6 was saying those people rights must be recognized, but there's no legislation. So that section deals with the communal tenure, land tenure, both communal and labor tenant and farm workers. So the legislation is called the Interim Protection of Land Rights Act, which is IPILRA. IPILRA, it is what Maledu judgment was based on. Says anybody who wants to do development in a communal land must have consulted and get consent from people. You understand? So IPILRA is a progressive legislation, but then it was countered by this the MPRDA enactment, but also the Traditional Leadership and Governance Framework Act, which required the traditional leaders of the Verwoerd era, who used to call themselves tribal leaders, to transform themselves into being traditional authorities, where they democratize by going to elections and making sure that 40% of the total committee comes from the majority in the village, and 60% is selected by the royal family or by the chief. So there's elective and selective. Now it is reversing the gains that we made through our constitution, because we said South Africa we're going to be one, Simunye, there's no apartheid boundaries, and we want to choose our leaders. So if you give the majority 40% in the traditional council, we know that the majority rules. It means the old tribal rules that oppressed people, that stole the identity of people, took the land from the people, is still in power. There's not no. So, but at least it was better. We were crying, only to find that the West is yet to come. So they are now coming with this Bantustan laws called Traditional Court Bill. So the Traditional Court will create a separate system of justice to South Africa. So only rural people who are staying in the Bantustan will not be able to go to a court of law which is recognized according to the constitution, but they will be summoned by a traditional leader sitting in a kangaroo court somewhere and tell you, and you cannot you cannot come with a legal representation, which is a constitutional right. You cannot also say no, I don't wanna come. And that traditional leader is being given jurisdiction over land. So that means even if you are a small-scale farmer who got land through slack redistribution, or you bought your own farm, that traditional leader can summon you. And if you don't appear, they can pass judgment in your absence. And we know how our customary bad practices discriminate against women. So we hear that women in the Bantustan, if you are called to the traditional court, you are not supposed to face people like I'm addressing you like this. You must face the wall and address these people. And sometimes you are not even allowed to make your own self-representation, you have to get a male relative to represent you. So it is not the law that the vision that we voted for, and we say no to it. We call it Bantustan Bill because it is not gonna work in South Africa as a whole. It will just be working in the traditional court, which we know that in the traditional court, if you are not a Zulu and you are a Motswana, you are someone you don't belong there. They will call you so many names because of their ethnicity and the thing. So traditionally we know that it promotes all those ethnic divisions. So they are not allocate land to women unless they've got a son or a male relative to unmarried women. They don't talk about them. LGBTI, no, they don't want to see you. So the other law now is the Traditional Leadership and Nkosi Bill. It's an act now. It's an act. So this traditional leadership was supposed to have recognized. The purpose was to recognize the nation, the forgotten nation of the Nkosi Bill, the Nkosans who have been, crying for recognition. We supported that bill because it is going to recognize these other South Africans who were forgotten. But then, because the TLFGA, even though it was not perfect, it had sanctions, it had accountability measures for traditional leaders. They need to call general meetings. They need to say what they did with if they collected tribal levies or whatever. There's a set of bottom lines that they have to abide in. So they saw that because the Nyalala Pilani and this Bakhataba Pilani case exposed traditional leaders that you cannot take decisions with your friends, the big companies and the government without consulting people. So they want to take a shortcut and recognize this one leader or one institution so that when they want to take the land and use, they mustn't come for the majority rule because it's going to take them time to consult. So what they want to do is to just make this one man sign, give them a cell phone and a new car, and that's it. So traditional leadership and traditional and Nkosi Leadership Act is dangerous in a way that Section 23 of it gives them powers to enter into deals without consulting people, but it also is not favoring any traditional leader really, because it gives the power to the president to appoint or to withdraw your chieftainship. So the power of the community or royal family to acknowledge you as their leader is being taken away by this bill. That power is now belonging to the president. So when the president will never appoint you if they know you are not going to say yes to mining or you are not going to say to shopping mall. So they have taken, they made sure that all those TLFGAs and progressive legislations that dealt with that is rubbed away. So it's replaced by TKLA, which is Traditional and Nkosi Leadership Bill. So the purpose was not to recognize the Nkosans because the Nkosans still cannot claim through restitution with that cut-off date. With that cut-off date, the Nkosans don't have any claim. The Nkosans didn't even have a territory. There's no map who can say this land was bought by the Nkosans because they proclaim themselves as hunters, as healers, as people who come from Namibia across. They don't have passports, but they know how to hunt and how to find healing medicine. So those people are not recognized by this law. The other thing is that we know we have 11 languages in South Africa. The only languages that are respected is these 2 foreign languages. And the Khoisan languages like the Nama, the Khoi, the Khurikwa, is still not recognized. They need to have made a gazette to make sure that these are recognized and can be taught in equal footing as other languages in the schools. So it is not about Khoisan, it's about our land rights, it's about the free for all, because the communal land tenure Act is still not there. So it means we don't have any law protecting the rural areas. So we depend on this Interim Protection of Land Rights Act, which is also an interim act, which the minister has to renew every year. So the minister just forgets to renew it, and then we don't have it. So for us, this progressive judgment, Maledi judgment, really entrenched and reinforced our customary law. But when we say forgotten rural, the forgotten rural, what is happening in the rural where these the royalties are coming? We have a case in Mbuso Mogale in northwest of the D account, where money is being looted from that D account, and those communities who are supposed to be beneficiaries of those royalties are poor. Their land is now being grabbed by migrant laborers. You don't know who's who in this when you get to Bapo, when you get to Bakatla, when you get to all these mining hosting communities. Because of it is neglected. And I remembered my grandfather's words when he said, this is not designed to deliver any land. This is designed for a black person to be slave in a modern way. Because if they come to they always dangle this carrot that we're going to give so many jobs. How do you become a job in your house and then a worker in your house? You should be a shareholder, and that is how we want our traditional leaders to think. We're not attacking them. We are saying, wake up. You are still being puppets of Verwoerd in the new form of Ramaphosa. You understand? So you cannot allow yourself to be getting salaries from government. You should getting your own revenue from the wealth that is generated in the land. So we are being forgotten as rural people. But also this Maledi judgment that you relate so much, I challenge you guys, researchers and everyone, to visit Maledi and Bakatla Bali settling, because they are not reaping their fruits still. The Pilansberg Platinum Mine is capturing even our human rights lawyers, paying them money and now you find the united community which went to court behind Maledi as settling clans. They are divided into three. Each and every one of them has their own lawyer. The lawyer is advising them the other way. Maledi is saying, let's fight for the land, let's get the land back. They are saying, no, what do you do with the land? Get cash and invest it into business, and mine will give you a procurement, and then you will divide your money. But procurement is not there. Everyone who thinks they will allow mine because there's going to be jobs, their mining company with this just transition and whatever, they're thinking far beyond what we are thinking. They are not going to hire labor anymore. They're not going to take land anymore. There is this new animal called triple crown, and it's going to, the wealth that is being generated in the rural areas is here in Johannesburg, with 5% beneficiaries of women groups who are wives of the ministers. So we have launched a Stop the Bantustan campaign to make sure that the president doesn't sign these bills, but the president has signed these bills. Therefore, we have taken the president to court, and because we always used Lamosa as a constituency-based organization to fight, and I am working for the Alliance for Rural Democracy with board members academic board members. That is why I am the first applicant in my personal capacity in the case against President Ramaphosa, making sure wanting to scrap and declare that law null and void. So we are challenging you guys, go to www.stopthebantustancampaign.org. There is a signing thing there. We are signing. Please sign, continue to sign. It's an endless petition to make sure that around the world, across rural urban, we are standing together against to stop the Bantustan. The Bantustan, we can say, is a rural struggle. It is not. Our domestic workers who are in Johannesburg, they They are here because of the circumstances of dispossession and dismantling families. So they are here. The rural students are here in the Johannesburg universities. So they must unite against the Bantustan. It should not be an Alliance for Rural Democracy campaign. It should be South African Black People's campaign. Let me stop there, and I thank you for the opportunity.
Ngibonge ithuba enginikezwe lona namhlanje ukuthi ngikhulume nani. Sibonge mama. It's a powerful story, and it has answered certain questions that I have. Not just a story, but a continuation of a struggle. And I'm grateful that you also shared it in relation to how your grandparents also saw it, because it shows this continuity. I had a presentation, I don't know if it will be loaded, so that you can see. So my work focuses on what I call the historical present, the historical representation of the present, or the representation of the present, or the past in the present, something like that. So with that being said, I thought hard as to what can I say about the forgotten rural. But I then decided that I will tell you a story of potatoes that look like humans. And I want to start with this idea of beyond the politics of public memory. And then as I tell the story, I want to be speaking of what I call the futurity of violence and its anxiety. And I'm using Bethel in Mpumalanga as part of my story. So the questions that I had coming into this conversation was, what does it mean to remember the rural? I don't know what's happening with the presentation, but it will catch up with me. What does it mean to remember the rural? But I also asked myself, what is the rural? Because I started doing a research in areas that are considered rural. Farm work is my area of focus. And most of the farmers that I researched were actually here in Germiston. And Germiston is actually an industrial area, and one can consider it to be urban, So there was always this puzzling question when you say, I'm looking at farm workers in Gauteng. They say, in Gauteng, what? Gauteng has farms, really? So that's, but I think this question has also been answered. Who is forgetting the rural? I think I'm on slide number 3. 2 years. So who is forgetting the rural? Can the rural be forgotten? But I think what we are also doing when I speak of this question of a historical present is also to remember in the future. So we are remembering the past and what can be said is the future. So those are the questions that I had coming into this, and I think a few have been answered. Remembering to forget. I think the preservation of memory through public acts, like let's celebrate this holiday, let's celebrate this or that, is an act of remembering to forget, where we bring up the past in the present so that we deliberate on it for a day, but then again forget, So maybe let us not engage in this politics of public memory, of remembering to forget, but try to create a collective act of memory making And this collective act of memory making is one that is seeking to shape the future, but while being aware of the past and its importance in the present. But when we think of a memory, I draw here on Oliver Sacks in his book, The River of Consciousness, where he says, we as human beings are landed with memories which have fallibilities, frailties, and imperfections, but also great flexibility and creativity. Confusion over sources or indifference to them can be a paradoxical strength if we could take the sources of all our knowledge. We would be overwhelmed with often how irrelevant certain information is. But memory arises not only from experience, but from the intercourse of many minds. So today we are creating, another form of memory, but that refuses to remember, to forget. So that's why then I tell the story of this human potato, a potato that looks like a human, because one would say it's false, it's just a fallibility of the memory. Let me take you back to history just a bit, because the story is historical. And by the way, I'm not a historian, so in the 1950s, there was a big shift in politics. This shift was a shift that focused on the rural, actually. It was a shift that focused on Bethal, Mpumalanga, in the eastern Transvaal, an area which is known for potato farming. And I'll tell you what happened as we go on. Bethal is a land donated, it is said, by two farmers, Cornelius Bloch and Beatrice Node. But they decided to name it after their wives, Elizabeth and Alida. So they compounded the two names to come with Bethal. But it had a religious significance to those Afrikaners in the area. They called it the house of God, coming from Jacob's dream in Genesis 28, verse 19, where Jacob had a dream where he saw a staircase that leads to heaven. So Bethel was the house of God for the Afrikaners who had come from the Anglo-Boer War, and they thought this was a place where they'd find salvation. But there was, of course, going to be an issue of labor. So they decided that they are going to bring in, as we know, when this question of labor applies, it's black people that come up. So they decided to say that black are going to work the land, because this is a labor, a land that is rich in potato farming, and it begins in the 1910s. But the crisis that they had was a crisis of attaining cheap labor, because if you look at the Eastern Transvaal, Mpumalanga, it's not close to the reserves or their homelands. So it's difficult to attain people to come work on the land. So they relied on the labor tenant system, but the labor tenant system can only give you enough people to work the land. So they then had a difficulty because the state was focusing on mining, ensuring that people move towards mining and dispossess people so that they can render their labor power in the mines. So the farms then petitioned the state to say, well, we know that there is a salvation in South Africa, that dispossession has actually made all black people criminals. So then it's quite easy, to attain all the labor of these criminals to come work on the farms. So people who were charged for not carrying a pass, they ended up in Bethal, And the idea was that they would work there for 3 months, but it continued way beyond 3 months because the farmer had ways to retain them there. So that's just the story behind Bethal. I would tell you about the prison labor system, but I'm a bit worried about time. But let me speak of the scandal. In 1952, Henry Nxumalo, as part of a drum magazine, he decided that he's going to go and research what was happening in Bethal. Dressed like a worker, went to the fields. And the picture that I started with in the slide, but I'll show you later on, is coming from that field work that Henry Ngumalo did. And this became a big story in the 1952. This became a big, brouhaha about Bethal. But in 1947, Reverend Michael Scott had already gone to Bethal with Henry Ngumalo. That's why he decided to go again. So Henry Ngumalo decides to go again 5 years later to Bethal, because they had been 1947, 5 years later he goes, and then he still discovers that the system is still the same. But what was happening then was that farmers would get workers, all the prison laborers and all difficult workers. They would strip them naked and then give them potato sacks to wear. And that way, in that way, the microphone is trying to manage my passion so that my voice does not go high. So, in that way, it's no longer on. Okay. So, in that way, it was to ensure that the workers do not escape, because they were facing, they said, the big challenge, 1947, when Reverend Scott was there, they said, no. It's not that the natives don't like to work the farms, just that, they run away. When they get to Bethal, they run away. So it's much better if they wear the potato sack, so that they do not run away from the farm. So they said the big issue that they face is desertion. But you will see another reason why workers decide to run away from these farms, because early on it was already discovered that in 1929, a farmer in Bethal was found guilty of killing a worker by flogging him to death while his feet were tied to a tree. And they go on to reveal all these, appalling stories. But in revealing these stories, members of the community were actually saying that the farmers were killing the workers and then planting them on the fields of the potatoes as unmarked graves, and then continue to plant as if nothing happened. In that way, that was to ensure that the person disappears completely from the system, so that when the government comes in and questions, you have 100 prisoners, why is it that when they return is now 50? Then he would say, no, the rest ran away, It wasn't a way to account for the dead. So, but no one believed the story, Henry Ngumalo goes in 1952, and then 1959, another big story comes from Bethal. It's strange that actually it seems to be going around 5 years, 7 years, uneven numbers, odd numbers, geez. Okay, so 1959 in Lagda farm, because I had to go back and visit Bethal, but I'm just telling you this story. Cornelius, a black worker, was killed. He had arrived on the farm on the 2nd, and 3 days later, he was killed. And then an inquest was opened around that time, 1959 March. And one worker then, testified that Cornelius was thrashed every day by the boss boy because he was slow. The boss boy shouted at him that when an animal does not work, we throw him out. This is Bethal. So the issue with getting all these prison laborers or people who were not used to the labor-intensive work of Bethal was that it was, strenuous, and it was very difficult if you had back issues, because you'd burn for hours, But the issue was that the bus boy, the black indunas, would carry a whip and constantly whip those who were slow. But they went as far as to kill them, but this they did with the farmers as well, But the major question was, why go as far as killing the workers, But my thing is that, well, this kind of violence, was a reflection of an anxiety about the future. Because if we think of 1948, the time period of apartheid, the United Nations decide to adopt the Universal Human Declaration of was human rights. From 1948 and then the 50s, we had this intense struggle against apartheid. But not only, it was an intense global struggle against whiteness. We even see it with the civil movement. So on the farms, there was this anxiety about the contestation of the future because the farmer was a minority. They brought in people whom they thought were criminals, remember? And because of this, and I'm arguing that the land question then became quite palpable there at that time. So it was to kill them, to remind them, that in the future you do not contest this land. Because if you do, this is what happens to you. So let's go to the next slide so that we see the pictures just a bit. So this picture was taken by Jürgen Schaderbeck in 1952. So these are the potatoes that look like humans. If you see some of the workers, I think they are wearing the clothes that are made from the potato sacks. And when he took this picture, it was when he was going to fetch Henry Nxumalo from one of the farms. And he also took another picture in the next slide, where you can see may you please move to the next slide, thank you. Where you can see the busboy, carrying that whip with him. So let me jump to the boycott then. The potato boycott. After the death of Cornelius, everyone decided that no, I think we have to do something about this. But the African National Congress and SACTU, the South African Congress of Trade Unions, and movements within Mpumalanga as well, through Gert Sibande, they decided to organize a boycott on the 26th of June 1959. But before I go into the nitty-gritties of the boycott, I think I want to speak to this quote I found fascinating that shaped my idea of seeing these humans that look like potatoes. In an interview conducted by Dr. Tshepo Moloi in 2008, in this interview he goes back to Bethal to understand, the life of the former labor tenants who are now living in the township. And one worker was to tell him actually what was the catalyst of this, a boycott. And he says it was revealed how on the potato farms, as they were digging potatoes using plows pulled by cows, a dead person, a human body, was discovered. Again, when the lorries arrived in Johannesburg, it was reported that in one of the potato bags appeared a human head instead of a potato. But I, for one, never saw it. I just heard when I arrived at Goli. It was then that the quarrel began. People in Johannesburg started accusing us of killing people and planting them as potatoes. When we arrived in Johannesburg, they would say, yes, we saw a potato that looked like a human being from the farm you were working on. You are the ones who are beating up people, you guns. And then let's move to the next slide. I also want to use this quote by Frances Bard. So Frances Bard, a unionist and a founding member of the African National Congress Women League, was to tell a story as to how they organized the public so that they do not consume the potato, And she says that we used to condemn a potato when we see one that had a hole or a black mark. We used to tell the people in the public meetings, you see, this potato here, it is where your child's blood went in. You see this mark here, it is the blood of our children. That's why the potato is so. The people started hating potatoes like anything. And even the whites, when they heard that we are boycotting the potatoes and that we say these potatoes are full of the blood of African people, then they also began boycotting them. That boycott was very effective, The farmers couldn't sell their potatoes anywhere, and at the markets they wouldn't even carry the potatoes. This is Francis Bard. So the effect of the boycott, the potato boycott, was that it drew on two things. If we think of the morphology of the potato, it has like tubers. The eyes, where new potatoes come from. And it is these tubers, I think, that Francis Bard is pointing to. But the community members were using this idea of a potato as if the potato was seen from the ground and seeing what was happening, and then interacting with the spirit of the dead, then coming back as humans so as to haunt that time, And indeed, it was effective, they say, because in 1959, when I read the newspapers, there are articles that say, farmers could not sell, and then farmers were also forced to return the prison labors, but only briefly. Like any moment of protest, it raises that brouhaha, and then we forget, But how did I come to Bethel? I come to Bethel because of this a letter. Let's move to the next slide. It's very, the text is really small, but I hope you can see it. I'll just leave it there. I won't read all of it. This letter. In 1952, Henry Nxumalo visits the farm. The South African Institute of Race Relations, then 2 years later, decides that they still want to investigate what's happening in Bethel. And then in 1954, a letter gets smuggled out of Bethel, written, "That is a great opportunity to write to you these few lines. There is a thing trouble us very much in this jail. We have transferred from Durban to Leslie Jail. There were no cases we got from Durban Jail, but in this jail, plenty of our friends are dead, and some are sick because of assaulting by the chief and his warder Boysen and Hotsia and Fender. Some of our friends have lost their life." I won't continue to read, but you can read that on your own because it would be there for a while. But what I'm intending to do when I read this letter, I had a moment of thinking about this question of land, and a scream and a shout, And I wondered, then what happened to this man? In a world with nobody to depend on, you shout, you scream, you bleed, and hope that salvation will come. Lost in this twisted world, hoping that somebody hears your cry, recognizes you as human, with blood and life. This is not just some world you were thrown in, but history tells you that this is your home. Your parents remind you that this is your home and you are linked to great ancestors who once lived in it. Then you encounter this letter, this terror, this struggle to hold on to the little breath of life that might get snatched. This letter from an unknown prisoner, written, a great opportunity to write to you these few lines. I felt that this letter was addressed to me, inviting me to see with the prison labor the hopeless despair he was in. The trouble with the eye is that it sees but cannot see itself. Shakespeare was to write in Julius Caesar that the eye sees not itself, but by reflection. So I invite you all not only to see with your own eyes, but through this reflection. In reading the letter, I felt that the author was no longer addressing those in the past, but addressing me directly. The letter haunted me, still haunts me. I wonder what happened. Oh, it sounds like a gun. Jeez. It happened to the man searching in vain for his name, if he received any assistance. How old was he? What did he hope to achieve by writing this letter? Ralph Ellison was to write in Invisible Man that history makes harsh demands of us all, and Du Bois had already observed that to approach the demands made by history on the individual, there must be some standard of ethics in research and interpretations. So in my practice of writing and researching, The aim was to locate myself in this dislocated, distorted reality and deliberating on my actions. Every form of action is grounded in morality, and once we touch the subject of morality, the ethereal subject of justice emerges. To demand justice from the past is to resurrect the dead as victors of the present, but also contenders of the future. The latter is chilling because it is subversive, showing to us what was supposed to be hidden, turning against the omnipresent power of the farmer to give us an opportunity to see Bethel, to see life on the farm, under the tyranny of the minority, wielding weapons that are about to turn against them in the future. The danger of violence is that to use it is to expose one's vulnerability and fear of the uncertainty that lies in the future. The rural remains a contested space, explosion of violence and terror, with the people struggling to hold on to their dead, seeking to free not just themselves, but their homes and their living dead. With that said, I think I will pause there, but the struggle does not end here.
Well, good evening, everyone. My name is Dineo Skosana, Nyakulum Zulu, and Kabulela Hape. And I'm going to be reading from my notes, mostly. I feel honored to share this platform with you once more. I'll see Yvonne and Glenn and my colleague Mbuso. And without wasting any time, when I spoke to the program conveners and the idea of this conversation being about the forgotten rural in South Africa, and the notion that if the rural is repaired, the country can function, I thought to myself, where's the rural in South Africa? I think that's the first question that came to my head. And I immediately thought of the rural as the former Bantustans, where the land was reserved by the Bantu administration for the discarded people, as Cosmos Desmond cites in his book on forced removals in South Africa. The reserved land for non-citizens, as Asconi has described, was arid, therefore less desirable and not economical. And just before 1994, there was the discovery of an array of minerals on the forgotten land, that is the forgotten rural. And these are coal, platinum, titanium, which had been mined elsewhere in the country. In these areas, so in the rural areas, the land had been prospected but not mined because of old property rights and old mineral rights order. And so essentially post-1994, the forgotten rural is remembered, but not so much its people. Its people, when remembered, are recollected as the historically discarded, the surplus people, who once more can be discarded. And this time by the reformed or transition state for minerals. And as a result, many communities, as Asconi has explained, are dispossessed for extractivism. And the rural is now a place of extraction and capitalism. So, for those who might not be familiar with my work, I focused on coal mining, induced dispossession, and the specific question that I look at is, I specifically look at the question of what communities lose because of mining. and coal mining in particular. And in this presentation, I focus on Somkele, which is mined by Tendele since 2007. Tendele mines anthracite coal. They mine through open cast, which mines the surface for those who might not be familiar with this method of mining. And as a result, they've relocated about 200 homesteads in Somkele and about 1,000 ancestral graves. Now, for this presentation, I want to focus on the consequences of the household and more so the grave relocations. And just to give you a background, I interviewed about 30 families. I conducted oral histories with them between 2019 and this year, which is 2022. And I visited 4 cemeteries, excluding those in the homesteads. And the families shared disturbing accounts of the relocations and the loss of land, and revealed undignified exhumations and reburials, with bones broken, and in other cases dismembered, and many graves lost because of an unsystematic process of exhumation and reburial. In my work and this presentation, I argue that the dehumanizing nature of the household and grave relocations by Tendele mine has led to spiritual insecurity. Now, before I get into detail about this concept, the idea of spiritual insecurity, I'd like to play a clip which I recorded, Babugina, whom I interviewed in 2019 and again this year, early this year in I think it was March. His home was relocated from Edubalenkunzi, and his family lost 17 hectares of their sugarcane farm. But then he then refused to have 27 of their ancestral graves relocated. So he took me to the grave site where they used to live, and I followed him and I asked him to record. And I'd like you to watch the recording, and then I'll go into the concept that I'm currently struggling with, or struggling to develop actually, which is spiritual insecurity. But I'd also like you to take note as you watch of how close the mining dump is to this gravesite. What you will see is that Obabugina delves into a story of his polygamous family, which was wealthy because his father married whose mom, who was from a Chipli family, and as a result, Ubaba wanikezwa Nkosi umhlaba. And so he also speaks in this particular clip about the wealth that the family had accumulated, but also how his father, Babugina, was instrumental actually in setting up families in the space. Now, well, as they're trying to play the clip, trying to play the clip, I think it's also important perhaps to share with you why I had thought recording would be important in this case. When I saw the close proximity of the mine dump to the graveside, I thought a photograph wouldn't really do justice in capturing how close the mining activities are to the graves. But also what you'll see is that the video then tells a story, right? So I was trying to actually show the distance, but instead the video then tells the story about the history Yagababa and their deep-rootedness to the land. It also reveals the making of a family's economic network and essentially the making of a community. I was also struck by his cognitive memory of the place and their lives, even though the mine has been scarred, the land has been scarred by mining rather. And so, for example, you'll see on this recording where Ubaba says, Amasimi, yiwo wonke lawo, right? Meaning these are all our fields. And he's speaking as if they're still there, though the land has already been mined, and so they're no longer there, and that's what you will see. The video also, speaks to the gravesite as a space. And I hope you see cemeteries differently after this talk, because the cemetery is an anchoring place, a site of connection. But because of mining, with the remains which now face in the direction of the mining stockpile, the gravesite is a site of a struggle between rest and disruption. The sacred and contamination. It is a site of the destruction of life, spirits, the environment, and histories, amongst other things.
Washo umama odadewethu washo umama 64 ngale
Okay.
umfana ngale lona ngane kamshana wami.
All right. Lana ubani ba?
Lapha umfowethu ubhuti wami.
Okay.
Umncane.
Okay.
Lapha umama wami bamkhonasi.
Okay.
Lapha.
Oh.
Lapha udadewethu lo.
All right ba.
Wehluleka ukufaka manje.
Yeah. Lapha konje nje ubani baba lapha. Oh ngiyaxolisa baba. Lana ubani baba?
Lapha ubaba omncane.
All right. Lapha ubaba omncane.
Ubaba omncane George.
Okay baba.
No umama ngalele ngishona ngo64. Ubaba omncane ushone ngo65.
All right.
Yeah. Lapha zingane zikababa zonke. Ngisaba ngabe athi ngihlaba.
Oh yeah, biloko kuhlaba.
Mhlawumbe iphume la.
Yeah.
Lapha ingane yakho baba. Ingane ka sisi wami dadewethu.
Yeah.
Lapha futhi izingane zikamama bonke laba.
Yeah.
Lapha izingane zami lezi 3.
Yeah.
Zithree ngane zami zini. Qale ngale ngentombi.
All right baba.
Lezo ngezigama nkosikazi.
Okay.
Yeah.
Baba amasimi wenu waya kuphi?
Amasimu yo wonke lapha amasimu la.
All right baba.
Amasimu konke lapha. Bese lapha phezulu lapho uma ugcina khona amasimu ngithi kunomhosho.
Yebo.
Sokuba nentaba iyahamba ithi.
Yebo.
Ngoba le ntaba lena nje kwakungibaba konke lapha le ntaba.
Yeah.
Wakhisa ubaba udladla ubaba. Yonke le mizi yakhisa ubaba.
Okay.
Yonke le mizi yakhisa ubaba. Umcelo lapha kukhululeni. Athi bonile. Umcelo kwababa. Yabona inkulu la.
Inkulu kakhulu.
Yamuzo ngale ubonile umuzo ngale ubaba.
Iyo nithile ama hectare lawo wanikeza.
Abana ama hectare.
Akusi ngisho ukuthi yilawo awayinikeze inkosi.
Baba beka ikhansela.
Oh.
Mase bamdala ka sithi induna ke nabo uthabe bafuna kufaka babu.
Yeah. Beka ikhansela yasenkosini ba.
Yasenkosini ngoba manje uphethe yonke into.
Ngoba wayeganele enkosini.
Yeah.
All right.
Makushona ingane ungayiwa bobekwe enkosini ungayiwa bobekwe enduneni.
Yeah.
Bikokubaba ekhanseleni.
Yeah.
Yena ubaphethe bonke.
All right. Cha
Izokufika enkolokodo.
Siyezwa kakhulu.
Iyo yonke lena ngale ngodadewethu bonke laba bakhela endaweni yakho baba. Isitolo lesi sibeke obaba. Indlela yonke ngayiphuma ojika la bakulawo muzi sikhombisa futhi.
All right.
Thank you for that. Just to recap, he has refused to have their ancestral graves exhumed and reburied elsewhere, and so he has moved and has left this grave site here. And so while some of the graves have been reburied, particularly those who have, agreed to the relocations. About 300 graves have been reported missing, and as I said in the beginning of my presentation, that in the process of the relocation, a very unsystematic way of relocating these took place, and as a result, these are missing. And so this has led to spiritual insecurity. And this is a state of disconnection and continuous anxiety about one's relationship and standing with those who have passed. And I must indicate that after arriving at this concept through my empirical work, I got excited thinking that this is a very original concept. And only to discover a month ago as I'm writing that the concept actually has been engaged elsewhere, particularly by anthropology scholars. And there's one particular scholar, Adam Ashworth, who is at the University of Michigan, and he's at the Center of African Studies. And he explored this concept, particularly in his own work, in which he works, in which he focuses on HIV/AIDS in Tanzania, and the use of non-Western medicine for treatment by priests. And his starting point is that spiritual insecurity emerges from relations with invincible forces. And he similarly, and I got excited at least that, okay, well, other people have worked on this concept, but at least we're not saying completely different things. And he similarly defines it as an existential condition marked by epistemic anxiety over relations with agencies deemed capable of causing harm or responsible for safety and well-being. So with the families I interviewed, their insecurities and the discontent state of their ancestors were validated by prophecies from traditional healers and sometimes through dreams. And many shared visions of their loved ones who were in despair. And the families shared feelings of guilt, helplessness, and worry, and as well as disorientation. And to highlight this concept, I wanted to share a quote which came up when I interviewed Ubabugina, and during our conversation, he shared how he got lost coming back from a Sontweni. Why Sontweni? He got lost and couldn't find home for some time. And he said, I almost died. I could not find my way back home for hours. Then I went to consult via to a traditional healer. And I found that Babagina, these are his ancestors, are complaining that when I was relocated, I moved away from them, and so they can't see me. So Tiwa Abamboni, Waba Uhambile, Wabayega Lab, and left them on the graveside. And I also spoke to Babu Mbuyazi, a 68-year-old environmental justice activist whose father's grave is lost. And it's lost because in North Coast, which was in charge of the relocation process, had used amamakas with plastic, and so these got eroded by wind, rains, and all kinds of things. And as a result, abantu batola matuna wabo. And so I asked him, Baba, so how does it make you feel to not be able to find your father's grave as well as other graves, because it's not just his father's? And his response was, Bunzima kakhulu, bunzima. It is very difficult, it is very difficult. I sometimes go to search. Ngiyahamba ngiyofuna. Emqondweni kwami kube ngathi ngiyasangama. In my head, it's as if I'm losing my mind. Impela akubuhle akujwayelekile. Honestly, it is not a good thing. It is something I'm not getting used to. And his words, as I'm working on a book, have stuck with me, particularly the line, "I sometimes go to search." It got me thinking, and I will share this with Zulu, because as I was writing, I started thinking, kusho ukuthi ubaba mhlawumbe uma kumele alale unocabanga ukuthi kusasa ngizovuka ngifuna ithuna la kababa wami. Yeah. Or unokuthi mhlawumbe mhlawumbe unokuthi athi edrobheni acabanga ukuthi hawu ithi mhlawumbe ngicela ukwehla ngifuna ithuna la kababa wami. So I started thinking, basically, I'm not going to translate this I'm not going to translate it into English directly, but I will say that, so I started thinking about whether he plans the activity to look for his father and it becomes a deliberate activity, or it's an impromptu thing. And I think that's, for me, that's what I struggle with as I'm writing and when I was talking to him. But I think this actually does highlight the idea of spiritual insecurity. Because actually this is the daily lived experience of communities, particularly many, not just this one family, many, there's over 300 lost graves, and all of those actually have representatives. And I think it's important to highlight how this is the daily experience of communities. And so there is no spiritual comfort. And so the communities experience a constant state of anxiety and wonder and discomfort. And I will conclude by saying that this constant anxiety and wonder and discomfort captures the experience of the forgotten rural, or of the rural communities, because this is their constant struggle. But I think, in closing, for me, I struggle, and I think this will probably inform my conclusion in the book, that why is a black man struggling to find his ancestral grave on his land post-1994? Why does he not have a place of rest, which he didn't have during colonial and apartheid South Africa? And he's still struggling to have that place where he will rest. And I think it's a very important question that shows how post-1994, abantu abamnyama, black people, they have, or they are given the privilege to vote, but they are not necessarily citizens of this country. They are not fully recognized, similar to how they were not recognized in 1910, right? And so this is a similar struggle many, many years later. And my question is why, as Mrs. Kony has said, and this comes up quite a lot in my work, that graves are a form of evidence. And my question is, why should graves be a form of evidence if people are citizens post-1994 in this country? So I will stop here.
I want to thank you, Skosana, Dineo, Mbuso. It is very heavy that the running thread is the graves. And perhaps I should communicate my own state of being emotional right now. Is that also in my own work, I think about graves. Thank you. I think about graves, and I write about graves. And like Osconi, it's a very personal story. My father is a fifth generation farm worker. And so you have my family working over 5 generations for the same white farmer family, the Kings. So everyone, up until my father's point, has been working for that same white family. And this is not a story unique to my family.
Thank you to the speakers for this profound presentations. So I'm just looking at this issue of dispossession of land, and then seemingly it's not just new phenomenon. This is a global kind of a trend of the people who lose their identity. So I'm just taken aback with the case of Palestine and Israel. Palestine can never have a rest, you know. There's nothing there economically, but they fight for their graves and reflection and their rituals and their practices. Now the question is, in our context here, do we trust our government? Do our government have a political will to take back the land to the black people, restitution? Because that opportunity was allowed in Parliament. The very same political parties, they opted not to vote. So do we trust them? Is there any political will to drive the process?
Take 3 more, because there's 3 people, and then
Okay. Also, please can you let us know who you're directing the question to, or say if it's to the panel and anyone can take it.
Go ahead. Okay. Thank you so much for the illuminating conversations. I actually have questions for everyone. I don't know if that's allowed. But I just wanted to ask Dineo, so this idea of spiritual insecurity, are you thinking about the temporal dimensions? Because of course when one is thinking about space and maybe a dislocation from space, one is also thinking inadvertently about a dislocation from time. So when Obabagina is looking for his father's grave, is he maybe not asking questions about his own future, the future of his own death? And is he not asking, how am I going to die? And in a very metaphysical way, is he not scared that maybe he's going to be indentured to immortality and that he'll be unable, essentially, to rest? And then to Mbuso, I just wanted to ask about the commercial agrarian structure that you're really alluding to. So what we're finding now with the redistribution landscape is that a lot of black farmers who are the targets of these redistributive schemes are being forced into this commercial agrarian structure, which emerged during apartheid, but was heavily subsidized. So they're now being forced to take up that type of farming. Literally, the state doesn't allow or doesn't favor the what's this thing when you cut land? There's a word. No, but I'm trying to keep it short. But ultimately, by compelling black farmers into this agrarian structure, are they not in a way being tethered to the institutional violence that the large-scale commercial farming is known for, and as you've described?
Yeah, when we say awethu ngengane bahlali basemjondolo, we were given that by Bongani Zulu. He was in Proteus out there as abahlali basemjondolo. Amanda. Thank you very much. I want to thank our speakers. It was a moving presentation. I want to comment and say my father died around 2012. I was to get married on 2013. He said, before he died, he said, I'm giving you your inheritance. It is my grave. That's the only thing I'm giving to you. Please protect my grave. So even today, I'm fighting mining in my area because I'm trying to do that responsibility that was given to me by my father. When we are talking about land, we are talking about identity. And don't forget, water goes with land, trees goes with land, minerals goes with land, animals, wild animals belongs to the land. That's why in our Zulu culture, when your father dies, when you do cleansing, you have to kill the wild animal to cleanse the weapons of your father. Thank you very much for a moving presentation. I'm still protecting my father's grave.
Amanda. There is a lot of things that we are familiar with. I'm going to mix with Zulu because we always speak Zulu. The first one is about graves. Here in Johannesburg, when you die, you are supposed to pay for the home that you are supposed to be buried in. I really don't understand that issue because of it is my last place where I'm supposed to rest. And I am dead. How I am going to get the money to pay that grave? 1,000 something. I'm a shack dweller, living in a shack, unemployed. And how will I pay for that grave? That is why I always tell people that it is the best to bury me in an indigent, because if you bury me there, it's going to be mahala, you are not going to pay. And I am going to be proud because of I didn't pay the home, my last home where I'm supposed to be. And then the other thing about relocation. Relocation is very difficult, more special to us as shack dwellers, because of at the end of the day, they relocate you from the place that the place that you know very well, and the neighbors and everything. And then the other one is, I have a community from Edamping in Vosmos, and then when the government official came, they said they didn't know that the dumping is there. But Edamping is being there for more than 30 years. When they want vote, they go to Edamping, but when they supposed to bring service delivery, they say, after maybe 5 councillors, they say they didn't know Edamping, and that is something that surprised me. But today, I have learned that Edamping, it is the similar as the rural place that are being forgotten, but they come to the rural, to Edamping because they are looking for vote. And I would like to mention the farm workers too. Those are the people who are building our economy. We have many farms around South Africa, and I think even the colony depended on the farming, and they're depending on the farm workers. The very painful thing is that they don't even have a share of what they are farming for. They are not even allowed to have cows, they are not even allowed to have sheep. Life is difficult, but we have to bring change. I think we are the change that we need, and we have to fight for our change. Thank you.
I think what we've seen, especially with all these cases that Cody had spoken about, is that the communities that organize actually best defend their land rights. And I think it's showing also elsewhere, and not just about the politics of land in South Africa, but how if we can start mobilizing around issues, actually that's the only way I think we can have an alternative system, which at SWOP we constantly are engaging about what the alternatives are. I don't think the alternative is this particular government, and maybe we need to think about whether the alternative is the state. Maybe the alternative is actually the people on the ground, and I think we have to think about that much more.
Also, do you want to? take your question.
Okay. Okay, the question on institutional violence, yes, I'm still thinking, sorry. On institutional violence. Well, before I answer the question, I think I have a fear, you know. My fear is to die in the city. Because if I die in the city, then it means I'm going to be buried in Avalon Cemetery, you know. And my fear is that even my enemies on weekends, they will come to my grave and dance on top of it. Jeez, that's a serious fear that I have about dying in the city. But this fear of dying in the city, you know, made me question the intention of dispossession. And what I'll come to the question as I'm thinking through, the futurity of violence. And I think we ought to extend this radical approach that we are taking to say, actually, if you think of it, when you look at Bethel, at first they were killing people because they thought they would contest the land in the future and burying them in unmarked graves. But now the people have graves and they can claim that they belong to that land. So that future, that anxiety about the future and belonging is realized because there are people who can claim that land. But now again in the future, you know, is the idea that people will come back and claim the land. That's why then the issue is about graves. But the issue about graves is to ensure that people, when they become dispossession, when Blachi writes about the 1913 Land Act, he shows us that black people became graveless. So we are dealing here not with people who have graves, but people who are graveless, actually. Because you can point that this one is resting there, but tomorrow they might disappear. So why are they disappearing? So that you do not contest the future. So in Bethel, when I went back, then, you know, the labor tenants who are there, they are saying they are moving us away. They are moving our graves away, so that we cannot claim this land. So that is the idea, you know. Maybe the idea is that the future for dispossession ought to be graveless. When we look at the big farms, well, it's the nature of commercial agriculture, that's what I'm arguing, you know. So this material is part of my forthcoming book. What I'm arguing is that when we look at agriculture, you know, we see this, you know, the dead emerging in all these unmarked graves. So this is not just the story of Bethel, you know, this is the story of commercial agriculture, a large-scale agriculture. But it forms part and parcel of dispossession. So, yeah, I think, again, I also said, well, there was that anxiety, you know, when I was doing the PhD, of a question of where will people die? It presents itself, you know, far beyond just a metaphysical or ontological question, but much more so also as an eschatological question. How would they return as spiritual beings? So it's also a question of the return of the spiritual beings and where they are. And it seems that they are haunting, you know, the living. Jeez, okay. Let me leave it there. Thanks for the questions there.